January 17, 1966. The sky over southeastern Spain is clear, pale, almost motionless. At more than 10,000 meters of altitude, the B-52G bomber Southern Belle advances silently over the Mediterranean. Its 8 engines roar with a low, deep sound that seems to come from inside the earth. Below it, the KC-135 tanker Troubadour holds a northerly course, ready for a maneuver the crew has repeated dozens of times: aerial refueling. The sun falls over a cold, quiet sea. The mountains of Almeria are barely a blurry line on the horizon. In the B-52 cockpit, Captain Charles Wendorf and Major Emil Chapla adjust the controls. They have been in the air more than 16 hours, flying from North Carolina as part of a routine nuclear patrol mission. There is no tension, only fatigue. The co-pilot checks the gauges, the navigator corrects the course, and Commander Clarence Shute, seated behind them, reviews the checklist in a monotone voice. Altitude steady. Speed constant. Refueling boom ready. Copy. The tanker's operator speaks over the radio in a calm tone. Southern Belle, this is Troubadour. You are cleared to approach. Maintain heading 080 and climb half a degree. Wendorf repeats the order almost automatically. 080, climbing half a degree. Through the top window, he can see the tanker's silvery belly drawing slowly closer. In the tail of the KC-135, a technician watches through the optical sight as he guides the articulated boom that must lock into the bomber's receptacle. At 10,000 meters, every centimeter counts. The air grows tense. The boom extends, trembles slightly, and lines up with the B-52's refueling port. A metallic click echoes in the cockpit. Contact achieved, the operator says. Copy, Wendorf replies. For a few seconds, everything seems normal. Fuel begins to flow. The gauges stabilize. Then, without warning, a downdraft hits the bomber. The aircraft drops barely 1 meter, but in that slice of sky, there's no margin for error. The refueling boom bends, the KC-135's tank tears open, and the air fills with aerosolized fuel. Wendorf feels the blow like a sharp punch to the fuselage. The panel lights up with emergency lights. Disconnect, he shouts over the intercom, but the spark arrives before the order. A sheet of flame rips through the sky. In seconds, the tanker becomes a sphere of fire. The B-52, wrapped in the blast, loses stability. The pressure of the shockwave tears off a wing, and the plane begins to spin out of control. In the cockpit, the instruments whirl like mad wheels. We're burning alive, Shute screams. Wendorf yanks the yoke, but the bomber no longer responds. The altimeter falls at a ridiculous rate. Eject! Eject now! The men throw themselves into the void as the fuselage disintegrates behind them. 4 parachutes open in the air. The rest vanish in the flames. As the aircraft breaks apart, its lethal cargo falls free of the bay. 4 Mark 28 thermonuclear bombs, with a combined yield of more than 4 million tons of TNT, begin their descent. They are not armed for nuclear detonation, but each carries enough conventional explosives to destroy an entire city block. 1 falls into the sea. 3 descend toward land. Below, the small farming village of Palomares has no idea what is happening. Neighbors look up at the roar. They see a line of fire cross the sky, followed by a rain of incandescent fragments. Children point. Adults run toward the fields. No one imagines that at that instant, 4 atomic bombs are falling above their heads. The B-52 disappears on the horizon wrapped in smoke. The air fills with the metallic smell of fuel. And in the seconds that follow, the cloudless sky over southern Spain becomes the stage for the most serious nuclear accident on foreign soil of the entire Cold War. At more than 10,000 meters of altitude, everything had begun with a routine phrase: hold course, climb half a degree, plug it in. No one ever said it the same way again. The explosion in the sky over Almeria was not an isolated mishap. It was the logical consequence of a policy that had decided to keep the planet suspended over a trigger. Since 1960, under the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, the United States had kept Operation Chrome Dome active. Dozens of B-52 bombers loaded with atomic bombs patrolled the Soviet frontiers without rest, day and night, every day of the year. Their mission was simple and terrifying. If the Soviet Union struck first, those aircraft would respond before touching down. The idea was presented as a perfect equation. Peace was sustained by the certainty of destruction. If both sides could erase the other within minutes, neither would dare take the first step. It was mutually assured deterrence, a balance of terror wrapped in technical language. Each B-52 carried between 2 and 4 Mark 28 bombs, each with a yield several times greater than the one that destroyed Hiroshima. They were the emblem of American nuclear power, but also the symbol of a routine skirting the inhuman. The crews lived in permanent rotation, 14, 16, 20 hours of flight, with the weight of the apocalypse under their feet. Fatigue, repetition, and trust in procedures became part of the landscape. In Air Force reports, accidents were reduced to figures: minor failure, controlled damage, tolerable error. But there was nothing tolerable about bringing two 100-ton machines to within less than 20 meters of each other at 1,000 kilometers per hour in turbulent air. Every refueling was a deadly choreography. A change in pressure, a miscalculation, a gust of wind, and the maneuver turned into tragedy. By the mid-60s, Operation Chrome Dome had flown more than 12,000 sorties. And although the official report spoke of efficiency, incidents piled up in silence: fires, wings tearing off, fuel leaks. In the hangars, mechanics whispered that it was only a matter of time before something went terribly wrong. That winter of 1966, when Southern Belle took off from North Carolina, no one was thinking about that. For the pilots, it was another flight, another patrol, another day under the logic of fear. No one imagined that that morning, the perfect balance of deterrence would collapse over a small village in southern Spain. The morning of January 17, 1966, began like so many others at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. The men of the B-52G Southern Belle reviewed their flight lists in silence. The hangar lights flickered over the bomber's gray fuselage, and the air smelled of kerosene and metal. In the cockpit, Captain Charles Wendorf checked the instruments with the focus of someone who knows the margins of error too well. At his side, Major Emil Chapla, his co-pilot, went over the radio codes. Behind them, Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Shute, mission commander, tightened his harness. His job was not to fly, but to ensure that the nuclear bombs on board remained safe over the 20 hours of flight. Captain Ivan Nagel, navigator, traced the route on the unfolded chart, from North Carolina to the Atlantic, over the Mediterranean, and back. In theory, nothing out of the ordinary. But in the bay rested 4 Mark 28 thermonuclear bombs, each with a yield of more than 1 megaton. Those weapons were not meant to be used, but their mere presence turned routine into permanent risk. At 3:00 a.m., the engines roared. 8 jets bit into the freezing air, and the bomber climbed slowly into the dark sky. Over the Atlantic, dawn found them at 10,000 meters, a bright point in the immensity. They had been flying 16 hours when they reached southern Spain. The routine of Operation Chrome Dome had turned them into automatons. Eat, log coordinates, check cabin pressure, wait for refueling. Fatigue was an unseen enemy, but it weighed on every movement. The aerial refueling was to take place over the Alboran Sea, off the coast of Almeria. The KC-135 tanker Troubadour from Moran Air Base awaited them on a precise trajectory, calculated to the second. From its tail, the operator controlled the articulated boom that had to lock with the bomber's receptacle. It was a millimetric dance between two machines of more than 100 tons, separated by less than 20 meters, linked by a flexible steel hose carrying thousands of liters of fuel. The Mediterranean shone like a sheet of glass. The sky, cloudless, seemed to promise calm. But there was something not in the manuals, an intermittent downdraft, barely perceptible, yet enough to upset the balance. Southern Belle. This is Troubadour. The voice came over the radio. Cleared to close. Maintain speed 450 and altitude 31,000 feet. Copy, Wendorf answered. On final approach. The refueling operator in the KC-135's tail watched through the optic. The bomber drew near with elegance, steady, perfect. Through the intercom, the technician's voice was precise, dry like a metronome. Slower, a little higher, good, contact. The boom locked. For a few seconds, all was silence. The gauges showed fuel flow. The men let their shoulders relax. Then, the plane shuddered. A lateral gust pushed the B-52 slightly upward, barely 1 meter. The metal boom bent with an unbearable screech. In the tanker's cockpit, pilot Paul Nash shouted, "Disconnect! Disconnect now!" Too late. The boom tore part of the fuselage. The KC-135's tank opened like a wound. Flaming fuel sprayed into the air. In the next second, the sky turned white. From the ground, fishermen and farmers saw a fireball slice through the clouds. It looked like a sun falling into the sea. The B-52 began to spin, with a wing torn off and fire in the cockpit. "We're on fire!" Chute shouted. "Eject! Eject now!" Wendorf replied. The plane broke in two. 4 parachutes opened in the air. The rest vanished in the explosion. And with the burning wreckage, 4 thermonuclear bombs fell from the bay, drifting slowly toward southern Spain. The mission clock showed 10:22 a.m. The sound of disaster traveled faster than the reports that would try to explain it. In seconds, the blue sky of the Almeria coast became a hell. The KC-135 Troubadour disintegrated first, a blaze devouring its fuselage before the fragments could fall. Burning fuel rained over the sea, forming a black curtain of smoke that rose hundreds of meters. The tanker's flaming remains hit the water with a force that threw up pillars of steam. The B-52G Southern Belle was caught in the wake of fire. One wing tore off instantly, ripped away by the blast. The 8 engines went out one after another, and the huge plane began to spiral. In the cockpit, Captain Charles Wendorf fought to keep control, the instruments flashing red and the heat unbearable. Behind him, Commander Clarence Chute shouted over the intercom, "Mayday, mayday, aircraft on fire! We're going down!" Oxygen burned inside the fuselage, panels tore free, and flames ran along the bomber's corridors like living tongues. The men tried to eject, but the warped structure jammed some hatches. Navigator Ivan Nagel managed to trigger his seat and was launched into the void, wrapped in smoke. Co-pilot Chopla did the same. Wendorf, burned and blinded by smoke, got the lower hatch open before being sucked into the air. Of the 7 crewmen, only 4 managed to jump. 3 were never found. The sea and the inland hills kept their bodies. The aircraft, now a mass of fire, finally broke apart over the coastline. Burning fragments scattered in an arc of more than 20 kilometers from the shore to the hills of Palomares and Villaricos. Witnesses on land watched the sky fill with glowing points raining over the fields. Some thought it was a meteor, others that a war had begun. Among the burning wreckage, something else was falling. 4 Mark 28 thermonuclear bombs, each weighed nearly 1.5 tons. None was armed for nuclear detonation, but their fall was no less deadly. The first struck near the coast without exploding. The second fell on farmland, breaking apart. The third partially detonated on impact, releasing its load of radioactive plutonium over the fields. And the fourth, slowed by its parachute, disappeared into the Mediterranean. From the village, farmers and fishermen watched the spectacle without understanding. Some ran toward the impact sites, others took shelter in their homes. The air smelled of kerosene and molten metal. Dogs barked, children cried, and the sky, so calm minutes before, became a mirror of fire falling to pieces. Over Almeria, the inferno lasted less than a minute, but its consequences would be etched for decades into the earth, the sea, and the memories of those who watched the dawn burn. The remains of the B-52 crossed the sky like a swarm of fire. 3 of the 4 Mark 28 thermonuclear bombs fell on land. The first device crashed into a ravine north of the village and was buried among stones and dust. The second fell near the road, smashing trees and throwing up a cloud of black smoke. The third hit a hill at the edge of a field, and its conventional charge exploded. The noise was so loud it was heard along the whole coast. An orange flare rose several meters before fading. There was no nuclear detonation, but the result was devastating. The heat of the blast scattered plutonium particles over the ground. Dust rose with the wind and drifted across orchards, olive groves, and the whitewashed houses of Palomares, a small farming town of barely 2,000 inhabitants that, until that morning, lived in a routine as predictable as the sea. Less than 1 kilometer from the impact, farmhands working the tomato fields felt a vibration under their feet. They looked up and saw glowing fragments fall, pieces of metal that drove into the earth or splashed into the irrigation canals. Women came out of their homes, children ran toward the smoke. No one understood what was happening. Francisco Simó, a fisherman on the coast, would remember years later. The sky opened and it started to rain fire. I thought it was the end of the world. Other neighbors said the air smelled of sulfur and burned gasoline, that window panes trembled, that the animals fled toward the sea. Some approached the craters thinking they could help the crew. They found twisted metal, parts with inscriptions in English, and charred scraps of fabric that the wind lifted like flags. A group of men tried to put out the fire with buckets of water, unaware that the ground burned with more than fuel. No one imagined they were treading a field contaminated with nuclear material. Children played with metal fragments. Neighbors picked them up as souvenirs. To the naked eye, nothing looked dangerous. There was no visible radiation, no strange smoke, no new odor. Only dust, ash, and silence. Hours later, the civil guard cordoned off the area. The first Spanish soldiers arrived with orders to keep onlookers away, but without explanations. Smoke still rose from the mounds of earth, and the air had a strange sheen under the sun. One guard muttered quietly, staring at the blackened metal. "This doesn't look like any ordinary bomb." A few kilometers away, one of the unexploded bombs was wedged in the ground. Soldiers planted an improvised flag to mark its position. The third, the one that had exploded, left a crater the size of a house. Around it, radioactive dust spread with every gust. In the distance, the people of Palomares watched gray spirals of smoke rise over the fields. They did not know that the most dangerous metal on the planet was traveling mixed with the air. They did not know that the dust they were breathing would never entirely go away. The noon sun kept shining as if nothing had happened. But that day, unknowingly, the village of Palomares became the scene of the worst nuclear accident in the history of aviation. The hours after the impact were absolute confusion. From the air, Spanish Army helicopters and American rescue craft circled the area. On the ground, civil guards tried to keep villagers back, but did not know why. On the hill, the bomber's wreckage still burned, and the smoke formed a black line the wind pushed out to sea. The first American officer to arrive was a commander from Rota. He stepped from his helicopter with his eyes fixed on the blackened ground. He walked among the wreckage and found a curved, dark green piece with letters in English and a serial number. He asked for a map, pointed to the exact spot, and spoke quietly with the Spanish captain beside him. Neither used the word in nuclear. Soldiers dug through the dust until they uncovered the first bomb. It was intact, caked with earth, with no signs of detonation. It weighed nearly 1.5 tons. Its surface, deformed by the impact, reflected the sun like a dirty mirror. Farther north, they found another, half buried beside an irrigation ditch. The third, the one that had partially detonated, was marked by an irregular crater rimmed with molten metal. A high, thin whine rode the heat in the air. American engineers knelt in the dirt and drove in portable meters. The needles swung farther than expected. One of them stood slowly, his voice unsteady. "We've got contamination." The Spanish captain frowned. "What does that mean?" The American did not answer. He ordered his men to extend the perimeter and keep civilians out. No one, not even the local officers, grasped the magnitude of what lay before them. The people of Palomares crowded behind improvised fences, watching soldiers stake the ground with posts and yellow tape. Some believed they were searching for missing pilots, others that gasoline bombs had fallen. A guard remarked, if they were just planes, they'd be done by now. By nightfall, the lights of military trucks cast shadows across the hills. The Americans worked silently, raising tents and unloading instruments no one recognized. The Spaniards watched without asking much. The order was clear: keep quiet. Among the charred remains of the B-52 lay the bodies of 3 crewmen, unrecognizable. Soldiers covered them with thermal blankets. Commander Shute, who had survived the jump, was found farther north with a broken leg. When asked how many bombs his plane carried, he answered hoarsely, 4. At that moment, the Americans understood one was missing. The news traveled encrypted by radio to Moran, and from there to the Pentagon. In less than 1 hour, the Broken Arrow Protocol was activated. The United States had just lost a nuclear bomb in the Mediterranean Sea. At daybreak, the wind had shifted. The smoke from the hills drifted offshore, and with it, part of the secret the air had tried to hide. On the coast, sailors and fishermen pointed toward the horizon. Several witnesses claimed to have seen something fall into the water, a rounded shape dragged by a white parachute. By mid-morning, an American helicopter settled on the beach. Officers of the U.S. Navy stepped out with binoculars and charts. One marked a zone in the sea, about 8 kilometers from shore, and said only, "There, that's where she went down." The message was sent in code to the U.S. Embassy in Madrid, and hours later to Washington. One of the 4 bombs was missing in the Mediterranean. It was the worst possible scenario. Broken Arrow was officially activated, a nuclear accident with possible weapon loss. Within days, the Almeria coast filled with uniforms and ships. More than 30 vessels, 3,000 men, submarines, and helicopters were deployed. From the naval base at Cartagena, Spanish units watched the area discreetly while the Americans drew search grids over the sea. Every coordinate was checked by sonar. Every echo was a hope. The sea, however, kept its silence. During the first weeks, sweeps yielded nothing. The Mediterranean floor, deep and cut by submarine canyons, became a labyrinth. The men of the USS Petrel, equipped with cranes and sensors, combed the zone day and night. Communications between ships were constant, measured, almost ritual. Every report ended with the same word: negative. Meanwhile, on land, the mood changed. The fishermen of Palomares watched the operations from their boats. Some were hired to help, though no one explained what was being sought. Villagers saw trucks arrive, antennas, engineers, and divers. No one spoke, but fear began to seep in. In Madrid, Francisco Franco's government received the information in secret. Admitting that a foreign nuclear device had fallen on Spanish territory was unthinkable. The U.S. ambassador, Angier Biddle-Duke, was summoned to the Palacio de Santa Cruz. Meetings unfolded in low voices with measured phrases. Washington asked for absolute discretion. Franco, pragmatic, accepted in exchange for control of the narrative. Officially, no nuclear accident had occurred. While politics tried to seal silence, the sea remained under the watch of dozens of ships. U.S. Navy engineers deployed experimental search gear, underwater television cameras, acoustic probes, and small cable-guided submersibles. Men slept little, drank cold coffee, and smoked without pause. Each new day without results increased pressure up the chain of command. On February 6th, a Pentagon officer sent a ciphered message: "Location still unknown, political pressure increasing. Continue intensive search." At sea, the sun glinted off the waves like an ironic lamp. Below, in the silent depths, a metallic object of more than 1 ton lay covered in sand, invisible to the radars. The bomb had not exploded, but its absence hung like a suspended threat. The Mediterranean, calm and blue, had become the most closely watched tomb in the world. In the days that followed, teams of American scientists began arriving quietly in Palomares. They came from Los Alamos and from the Atomic Energy Commission, with instruments the locals had never seen: portable detectors, Geiger counters, alpha particle meters. They wore gray coveralls, masks, and gloves, but avoided talking. They only measured, noted, and moved from one field to another under the curious gaze of farmers who kept working as if nothing had happened. What they found could not be papered over. Radiation readings exceeded normal levels by several orders of magnitude. The conventional blast of one bomb had dispersed plutonium-239, the most toxic material known to man, over more than 2 square kilometers of land. The particles had mixed with dust, and the southeastern wind had carried them across orchards, wells, rooftops, and pens. The Americans set up checkpoints and took samples of water, leaves, and air. Every analysis confirmed what no one wanted to hear: contamination was real, persistent, and growing. But the orders were clear: keep the secret and avoid panic. Meanwhile, the villagers kept to their routine. They plowed, irrigated, harvested tomatoes, slept with windows open. No one evacuated them. No one explained what radioactive contamination meant. Some noticed that American soldiers were starting to mark areas with red tape and to dig trenches, but did not understand why. A Spanish military doctor was sent from Almeria to examine the neighbors. He checked several families, drew blood samples, and wrote a detailed report. In his conclusions, he recommended temporary relocation of the local population and ongoing medical monitoring. That document never saw daylight. It was filed, sealed, and censored. In public, the message was another. The official press, directed by the Franco regime, ran placid headlines: "Air accident without consequences." Military spokesmen repeated that the danger was under control. No one mentioned the word plutonium. In private, the Americans worked without pause. For weeks, they excavated the ground with mechanical shovels, removing the upper layers of soil. They did it at night, under floodlights. Soldiers filled metal drums with blackened earth and loaded them onto military trucks. The convoy headed to the port of Cartagena, where the containers were sealed and shipped aboard U.S. Navy vessels bound for South Carolina. More than 1,400 tons of soil were removed and confined in a secure repository in the Nevada desert. No Spanish newspaper published the figure. Through Palomares, a rumor spread. They say the dust is sick. Mothers began to forbid their children to play near the craters. Men stopped lighting cigarettes with lighters while working the fields. The air had a metallic taste, and the soil a different shine under the sun. No one knew for sure what had fallen on their village, but everyone understood, instinctively, that the enemy was no longer visible. Under their feet, the dust kept breathing. The sea had kept its secret for almost 3 months. From January to mid-March, American vessels swept the waters off Palomares without rest, dividing the Mediterranean into grids, sounding, dragging, looking for a metallic glint in the darkness. Each day, without results, increased political pressure on Washington and Madrid. Headlines in Europe spoke of a ghost bomb that could explode at any moment. Aboard the USS Petrel, Commander William Guest barely slept. He personally supervised radar reports and sonar readings. Radio exchanges were tense, measured to the millimeter. Negative in Sector 4. Recheck Grid 6, repeat sweep. The silence after each report was heavier than the water. On March 17th, the mini-sub Alvin, a white steel capsule with room for 3 men, descended slowly by crane cable to 870 meters. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Don Walsh, watched the low-resolution video while the sub's lights lit the seafloor. Sand, algae, fragments of the plane, and suddenly, a rounded shape, smooth, barely visible beneath a skin of silt. "Visual contact, metallic object," he reported by radio. On the Petrel's bridge, the officers held their breath. There it was, the 4th Mark, 28 thermonuclear bomb, half buried in sand, still with its parachute spread like a white jellyfish trapped in the current. There was no sign of structural damage, but the mere sight of it was enough to freeze the air. The first recovery attempt began that same night. The Alvin fixed a hook to the parachute rigging, and a Petrel crane began to lift slowly. The cable strain was immense. Mid-hoist, the steel groaned like thunder. "She's coming loose," a technician shouted. The cable snapped, and the bomb vanished again into the abyss. The silence afterward lasted minutes. No one spoke. Walsh tapped the sub's panel gently, as if apologizing to the sea. In Washington, the Pentagon ordered them to continue without rest until the device is recovered. The press must not learn they had lost it a second time. Over the following days, engineers set a new plan: a braided steel net and a reinforced cable. The Alvin descended once more, moving with surgical precision among treacherous currents. The pilot clipped the hook to the parachute ring and backed away carefully. Above, on the Petrel, the winch engines began to turn. The ascent was slow, exasperating. Hour after hour, the crane wound in without pause. As the object rose, the cable's tension could be felt even from the bridge. Men stared at the sea in silence, fixed on the point where the steel line emerged. And then, after nearly 10 weeks of searching, something broke the surface. A dark shape, coated with algae and salt, the bomb appeared wrapped in nets dripping water and mud. Sailors stepped back instinctively at the sight. It did not explode. It did not move. It simply rested, inert, on the deck under the pale light of dawn. Commander William Guest took off his helmet, breathed freely for the first time, and murmured, "There she is, our 1,000,000 tons of diplomacy." An operator noted the exact time, 9:47 a.m., April 17, 1966. Palomares bomb number 4 had returned from the bottom of the sea. The Mediterranean closed over itself again, as if nothing had happened. But for those who were there, that day was a mute warning of how far luck kept writing the history of the Cold War. At the beginning of March, political tension had reached a boiling point. The international press was already speaking of the Palomares nuclear accident, and photographs of soldiers with masks and radiation meters had begun to leak in France and the United States. Washington feared the episode would undermine its credibility with NATO. Madrid, that it would endanger military and economic agreements with the Americans. It was a crisis to be resolved not with technology, but with theater. On March 8, 1966, the authorities decided to present an image of normalcy to the world. Under a mild sun, journalists and photographers were summoned to Quitapelejos Beach on the Palomares coast. There, in front of the cameras, U.S. Ambassador Angier Biddleduke and Spain's Minister of Information and Tourism, Manuel Fraga Iribarne, appeared smiling in bathing suits. Behind them, the sea shone blue and perfect, as if it had never known fear. Fraga, burly and broad-smiled, raised his hand and shouted, "The water is marvelous," Duke answered in English calmly. "There is no danger, only sun and friendship." Both waded slowly into the water, followed by reporters and cameras. They posed, swam a few meters, and laughed while photographers fired endless bursts. The images went around the world within hours. 2 statesmen happily bathing in the Mediterranean, a symbol of confidence and control. But that swim was more than a gesture. It was a carefully staged propaganda operation. The set piece sought to bury with a smile the greatest nuclear accident in aviation history. The press write-ups drafted in advance spoke of cooperation, of friendship between nations, of the end of the alarm. Spanish headlines proclaimed, "Ministers bathe at Palomares, everything under control." Behind the forced optimism, reality was different. A few kilometers away, American engineers were still digging contaminated soil, sealing drums and marking prohibited plots. In some fields, tomato leaves showed an anomalous sheen, a dust that refused to vanish. Farmers, watching the cameras from afar, knew that the sea those ministers were wading into was not the same they had seen days earlier, when helicopters combed the coast searching for the missing bomb. For Franco's regime, the accident had been a dangerous humiliation. It had allowed foreign nuclear weapons over Spanish territory, something the population knew nothing about. Admitting it publicly would have meant admitting subordination. Hence, the swim was more than an anecdote. It was an act of political survival. In Washington, the State Department celebrated it as a media success. The headlines in Life and the New York Times spoke of a reaffirmation of the Western Alliance. None mentioned the fenced hectares, the destroyed crops, or the emptied homes marked in chalk. That same week, the Americans shipped the last barrels of contaminated soil to South Carolina. Operations officially concluded, and the village was declared safe. But the orders in military reports were clear. Inspections would continue in secret for the coming decades. That swim did not cleanse the sea, nor did it wipe the dust from the ground. It only covered the disaster with a smile that still appears in the archives, 2 men in the water waving at the cameras, while behind them, an entire country tried to forget what it had breathed. The Palomares accident was not only an air tragedy or a technical error, it was a turning point. That day, when the sky over southern Spain burned with fire and plutonium, it became clear that the world's nuclear balance could be broken not by war, but by carelessness. In Washington, the Pentagon and the State Department understood that the line between deterrence and disaster was far thinner than they had wished to admit. In the months that followed, the U.S. Air Force reviewed its safety protocols. Chrome Dome flights continued for a while, but the Palomares accident was etched in the High Command's offices as a warning. 2 years later, in January 1968, another B-52 went down at Thule, Greenland, with 4 nuclear bombs on board. The story repeated itself. A conventional explosion, radioactive contamination, a desperate search under ice. It was the final blow. The operation was suspended. Reports later declassified revealed that between 1950 and 1968, the United States had suffered more than a dozen nuclear accidents, lost bombs, destroyed planes, partial detonations, aborted missions. Palomares was the best known, but not the only one. Only the one the world saw, because the rest lay buried under layers of secrecy and bureaucracy. In Spain, the episode was never officially recognized as a nuclear accident. Statements from Franco's regime spoke of an air incident without civilian casualties, and of exemplary collaboration with the United States. The rest was buried under sand. But the consequences did not vanish. Over the following decades, both governments signed secret radiological monitoring agreements. Teams of American technicians returned periodically to Palomares, took samples, measured the air, and left without explanations. Residents were advised not to disturb certain zones, not to dig too deep, not to build outside marked limits. No one spoke openly of radiation, but everyone knew the danger was still there, invisible and every day. Through the 1980s and 90s, the issue resurfaced in the media from time to time, always accompanied by official denials and promises of a definitive cleanup. In 2015, half a century after the accident, an independent study by the Center for Energy, Environmental and Technological Research, CIEMAT, confirmed what many suspected. Plutonium levels in the soil still exceeded natural values in several plots of the municipality. 50 years had passed, and there were still fenced lands, fallow fields, zones that glowed on radiation maps. To the naked eye, Palomares looked like any village: whitewashed houses, briny air, children playing by the sea. But beneath the surface, the memory of January 17, 1966, remained alive, latent, invisible. The world had learned the lesson, or so it said. But the earth of Palomares, silent and persistent, kept reminding us that the weapons of the end of the world do not always explode. Sometimes they fall, they bury themselves, and they stay. The sun slides slowly over the hills of Almeria, tinting the olive fields and orchards that stretch to the sea with copper. The Mediterranean glints with a deceptive calm, as if that sky had never burned. Under that apparent stillness, among orange tree roots and the scorched stones of ravines, a buried story sleeps. In 1966, the world came within one error of turning southern Spain into a dead zone. 4 atomic bombs fell from the sky, and none exploded completely. But what descended that day was not only metal, it was a naked truth. That chance could decide the planet's nuclear fate. That civilization might depend not on strategy or power, but on a few seconds of wind and a small failure in a routine maneuver. Time has covered the scars, but has not erased them. Half a century later, the people of Palomares still pronounce the word bomb in a whisper. The elders say it with a mix of fear and resignation, the young with contained curiosity, as if naming a legend that is all too real. There are still fields left untilled, closed parcels, and paths where detectors still show numbers no one says aloud. At dusk, shadows lengthen over land once marked by fire. The oldest recall the roar in the sky, the rattle of panes, the smoke that seemed never to end. Some keep pieces of metal as keepsakes, unaware that inside them sleeps the story of an invisible danger. Empires moved on. They built bigger, more precise, cleaner weapons. Missiles became invisible, systems smarter, protocols more infallible. But something changed after that flight. Routine lost its innocence. Every time an armed plane takes off, every time a bomb is transported, the echo of Palomares resounds in the military memory of the century. Because that January 17, 1966, in a clear sky over Spain, human error loosed the world's own shadow, and although the bombs did not explode, they left a scar that still gleams under the sun, a buried warning, silent, persistent. Waves still break softly on the coast. Children play in the sand, not knowing that, under their feet, history keeps breathing. The sky is blue again, the sea serene. But nothing since that day ever returned to truly normal. Palomares remained on maps as a small blot on the edge of the Mediterranean. In the world's memory, it remained as a reminder that even in peace, the weapons of the end of the world are still awaiting orders, and that sometimes the difference between dawn and ruin, between life and nothingness, can depend on the tremor of a hand and the whim of a current of air.